This is a D6 Generation Pep. Bite-sized content for a busy gamer. Sometimes featuring Craig, sometimes featuring Russ.
Hey, what about me?
Oh yeah, and sometimes featuring Rafe, Hollywood Granger.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the D6 Generation. Thought this time I'd go back and do a little bit of mulling mechanics. I'm not sure we've done a mulling mechanics episode in a while. And I thought today I might share with you a little bit some of my thoughts on asymmetric gameplay. Games that have different play styles, abilities, powers, even mechanics for different players in the game. And I thought I'd kind of go through some of these historically, the ones I've enjoyed and haven't enjoyed, but also some of the things I think about when I think about asymmetric gameplay. Just kind of a fun little thought exercise here for maybe when you're looking at your next game. So let's define asymmetric gameplay first a little bit. And the reason this is top of mind for me, before I get into the definitions, is Kit and I, my youngest daughter, who's getting ready to go off to college right now. So man, time flies. But Kit and I are playing a lot of games since her older sister's been away at college, and she and I have been spending a lot of time gaming together, and I just can't recommend enough how much fun it is to play games with your kids. And we've been playing a lot of games with different rules for different factions and different player rules, and it's just been really interesting to me to see how lately I think a lot of interesting games are really doing some crazy stuff with asymmetric play, and so it just became top of mind for me, and I thought I'd share some of my thoughts. So what do we mean by or what do I mean when I say asymmetric gameplay, right? And the thing I think about is basically it means that the players have different play styles, play types, even sometimes play rules than each other, right? So for example, a game like chess is not an asymmetric game, meaning both sides have the exact same abilities. The only slight bit of asymmetry is that white gets to go first by the rules of the game, right? So one side always gets the first move, but other than that, everything in the game is identical. And in more modern games like this too, the Duke is another example of this. Well, the Duke is an interesting example from our friends at Catalyst Game Labs. The Duke is a game where you pull tiles out of a bag, right? And you play these tiles onto a chess or checker-like board. And then these tiles each have different movement styles. Now, in the core game of the Duke, both players' bags are filled with the same tiles. So the game may progress asymmetrically, meaning that as I draw tiles, I might get different ones than you get. But overall, I have the same odds, same likelihood, same access to the same powers as each other, right? Whereas there's also variants of the Duke where one side has different tiles in their bag than the other, right? So in that case, I may have a different play style on my side of the board because I may have more pieces that move a certain way or fight a certain way than my opponent, right? So there's a good example of a game that has symmetric gameplay with asymmetric progression, kind of, I guess, right? Because your side can evolve differently than your opponent's over time. Unlike chess, that doesn't really happen. When I say evolve, I mean your powers and abilities can change over time. And in your opponent's side of the thing, or sorry, in the other variant of the Duke, you could have sides that play very, very differently or have different kinds of abilities and powers. What are some other games like this? Well, another great example of sort of games that have asymmetric and symmetric gameplay. It's kind of like when you think about the most basic level of asymmetry in a game, it's that all the core mechanics of everything in the game are the same for all players. It's just that each of the players' sort of factions or pieces or side or role or whatever you want to call it, each of those things a player could choose to play with the game could have slightly different bonuses or abilities than each other. So our core mechanics are all the same. I can look over at you and I know you get to move twice and shoot once or whatever, but maybe maybe you move slightly farther and I move slightly slower, or maybe you shoot slightly faster and I, more accurately than I do or something like that. But I know you get this number of actions and I get this number of actions, and our ways to win are identical. So I can glance over at you and understand right where you're trying to go. So a great example of this is the game Eclipse, right? So Eclipse is a 4X space game. I almost said exploration, but that's one of the X's, right? You expand, you explore, you exploit, you exterminate, right? And What's interesting about Eclipse is all of their player colors have two different sided mats. On one side of the mat are the humans, right? And there's a human version of every color in the game, green, red, yellow, they're all humans. And the humans all have the exact same abilities. So you can play a game of Eclipse with completely symmetric abilities. Now it can have asymmetric progression, as I was saying earlier, meaning that I might choose one particular tactic and really go heavy into exploiting and harvesting and building a economic engine, and another player, and so I might build my ships, equip my ships that way, build my empire that way, go down the tech trees that way, where my opponent, who has the exact same tech tree, he or she might choose to go for a more combat sort of approach, right? And so even though our rules are the same, we might choose different gameplay styles, but that's still, in my mind, that's still symmetric play. That's just asymmetric strategy. Now, the game's got enough depth to it where you can do that, but where I'm going with this is, though, if you flip those faction colors over in Eclipse, for example, each of those aliens becomes an alien species, right? A non-human species, I should say. And those species then have very different abilities. Now, the core rules are still the same, right? But the shapes of their ships and where you can plug things in are slightly differently. They might gather certain bonuses for certain play styles. So some of the factions might be better at economics and exploiting worlds. Other factions might be better at combat and get more victory points rapidly that way. I can still look over at you, though, and know how your movement works, know how your combat works, right? I might look over jealously and see, wow, you're really getting a lot of resources per turn from that one planet. I wish my guys could do that. And he might look back over at you and go, that's cool, but I wish my guys could fight with the bonuses your guys get, right? So that's the asymmetry part. But in the end, we still can kind of glance at each other and know what's happening. And once we kind of learn the rules, I can look at your mat, you can look at my mat. We know the differences and kind of get it, right? Another great example of this is the newest edition of Clash of Cultures. So I think you've heard me talk on the show before. I'm a huge fan of Clash of Cultures, right? It's a great classic civilization building 4X game. And in the original Clash of Cultures, all the factions were started out symmetrically, right? Same pieces, same mechanics, same tech trees. And as the game progressed, you would choose which way you want to go, right? But now they added an expansion back in the day, and now the new mega version of Clash of Culture, the Monumental Edition, it's called. That version, I think I mentioned on the show before, that version includes different cultures, kind of like Civilization, the video game. You can pick different cultures, and those give you different additional powers as the game progresses. So when you get certain technological advances, you get bonuses to certain tech advances essentially in the game, which gives you buffs, which sort of implies a play style, right? Some of the factions do better at trade. It's kind of like with Eclipse. Some of the factions do better at combat. Some of the factions do better at exploring, naval versus, ground, that kind of stuff. So it really does get a play style going. And the thing I like about this, which is a lot of fun, is that because it does encourage different play styles, it makes the game more replayable, right? And so this is where one of the big advantages of asymmetric gameplay. Symmetric gameplay has the advantage of easy to teach. You can completely understand the game. Once you understand your position, you understand everybody's position. And if you play again, you learn the game faster. When you introduce asymmetry, even a little bit, like we talked about with either Eclipse or with Clash of Cultures, and these are sort of common ways they do it in these sort of civilization building games where you have, or any game with factions, right? The way they handle the asymmetry there, not super extra level of complexity, but it does create a little more to learn. You have to, if you're really the kind of player that really wants to understand what everybody's doing to win and how they're going to get there, what you should watch out for, it becomes a little trickier because you now have to understand the nuances of the overall game mechanics. You need to understand the nuances of your faction, and you kind of need to understand the nuances of your opponent's factions. And as you add more players, right, in a multiplayer game, head-to-head, even if there's a lot of factions you could choose from in a head-to-head situation, I really got to just know quickly in the first, few rounds what my faction does, what my opponent's faction does, and I'm fine. But if you had 3 or 4 players, now I kind of got to understand how everybody's unique factions' abilities are. So it does add a level of complexity, but for most, medium weight to heavyweight gamers, that's welcome, right? Not only is that it's something to learn, it's an enjoyable part of the game, right? But not everybody likes that level of complexity. Now, a different way, completely different way, you can introduce asymmetric play is the way a game like Smash Up does it, where the core mechanics are essentially identical, where we're going to we're going to play cards and try to capture these bases in the middle of the table, and all the players are vying for this, and we all have essentially either hero or character cards and then action cards. But there are a bunch of, and Dominion does this too, right? There's a bunch of different decks, right? And then you are dealt a random pair, or you can pick 2 different decks that you put together, 2 different factions. So I might choose fairies and, knights, or now they've got licensed stuff in there. So it could be, Marvel, the Spider-Verse plus the Avengers. It could be, they just got Disney in there now. So it could be Wreck-It Ralph combined with Frozen, whatever. And all these things are compatible. Basically, you get 2 of these random decks from various memes or cults of culture or whatever. There's pirates out there. There's dinosaurs, you name it. It's in Smash Up nowadays. I think I've got like over 90 different decks. It's kind of ridiculous. But in any case, you get these 2 decks smashed up, and it's like asymmetric abilities now, right? So my 2 decks just got smashed up, creates a unique set of abilities for me as a player. And then my opponent's got 2 more different decks. Now I understand what they're trying to get to. We're all searching for the same number of bases to capture, same kind of victory points. We all have the same actions per turn. However, right, what's interesting is I don't know exactly the play style yet unless I know all the decks really, really well. And there's so many decks in the game, it becomes very hard to know them all. So you have to kind of be okay with not having perfect information. And you have to be okay with kind of things being a little bit crazy and hectic as you try to figure out play styles and what your opponents can do and how they can follow your plans and vice versa. But again, what's really great about this asymmetric play is it introduces sort of some excitement to the game. Even though it may be a game like I've played many, many games of Smash Up now, I still never know the exact game I'm going to get. The combination of cards I get plus all my opponents get makes for a completely different game, which adds to the fun. It makes it a little harder to have perfect knowledge, which I actually like. I'm not as huge a fan of chess because basically a player can sit there for a long time with analysis paralysis, essentially, and work at all the permutations of the possible move and select the theoretical best move, right? In a game like Smash Up, that's not really possible. There's too many moving parts, right? So this is one of the other advantages if you're a player like me. Now, if you're a player who really enjoys having perfect information and understanding the complete spectrum, you might find Smash Up a little bit too frustrating, or maybe even it might feel a little too random for your taste, right? So there's both sides of the coin here. Now, what's interesting about what we've talked about here, like Smash Up and Dominion is similar but different. So deck builders are similar where you're building these decks. Now, the thing though about a deck builder like Dominion is you all start with the same cards and you all have access to the same market. So I would argue that Dominion is less asymmetric gameplay for each player and more asymmetric progression, right? So that's actually an example, kind of like the Duke, where you start equally and things get different. So when I think about asymmetric gameplay, my true definition of it is that both sides function, have different abilities and different bonuses and deficits from the get-go. So far, the games we've talked about have all been games where the core mechanics are the same pretty much for everyone, and there are just buffs or modifiers throughout the game for different factions and play. Maybe you have different access to a few different units. They might function slightly differently, but overall, the mechanics are the same, the victory conditions are the same, everything else is the same. Now, what got interesting for me was when I started getting into games where some players had literally different rules, different game mechanics, right? Different play abilities than other players. And the first time I ever ran into this, and I didn't really think about it this way at the time, but now I do, was actually when I started playing one versus many games, dungeon crawlers like Doom and Descent and Descent Second Edition. And there's been several others that way. Level 7 from Privateer Press, one of my favorite versions of this sort of thing, where several players take on the role of heroes or adventurers going into a dungeon. That's the case in both in sort of Doom is the old video game, different space marines. You got Descent where you're taking on the role of sort of classic fantasy heroes. And then you've got level 7 Omega Protocol where you're taking on the role of sort of like special ops agents armed to the teeth with near future technology going in against, basically Area 51 full of aliens, right? So in all three of these game examples, right, most of the players are playing heroes, and the hero mechanics are pretty consistent. Now, the heroes are also asymmetric, though. Each of the heroes has slightly different abilities, but their mechanics themselves, how each hero works, is identical. It's just that they all have different buffs and slightly different abilities, kind of like the civilization building games we were talking about, right? Like their mechanics are all the same. However, there's one player in all these games whose mechanics are completely different, and indeed, their objective is completely different. And that is usually in Descent, they called it the Overlord. And in level 7, it was the alien villain. So basically, they take on the role of an evil game master, essentially. I call them evil because they're not really a game master at all. They're just another player trying to win. And so it's a semi-co-op game, right? And I call them one versus many because you've got the one player who's trying to beat the other 3, typically in like a 4-player version of this. And that player's mechanics are completely different. They're usually controlling many different, in these 3 dungeon crawling examples. They're controlling all these different minions running around the dungeon, right? All these little models running around there. They're controlling the traps. They're controlling the villains. They're playing cards and dark magic. And because of this, their mechanics are completely different. In level 7, their mechanics are extremely different. And so everything these players can do is very, very different, right? And so that's a great example of asymmetric play, but it's not as intimidating because there's one player who has to understand his or her role, the game, the villain, if you will, the person playing the dungeon itself. And then you have the other players whose mechanics are all the same. So there's really just 2 sides to understand. And I think when you only have 2 sides to understand, it keeps it relatively simple. Another great example of asymmetric gameplay. One of my favorite 2-player games of all time is actually a game called Stronghold. And Stronghold, I have the original version of Stronghold back in the day from Aiello. And then I have the new version of Stronghold, the one that Stronghold Games did a few years ago. I still prefer the original better just because of the original art, although the one that Stronghold Games did is also quite good. And I think still available too if you wanted to try to find it. What's interesting about Stronghold is it is a very asymmetric 2-player game. Now you can actually play 3 players and 4 players, but the game really shines, I think, at 2 players. So what makes the game really cool is one side is playing all the forces that are defending a castle, right? And the other side is playing all the forces that are assaulting the castle. In the original edition of the game, the assaulting forces are basically orcs and trolls and that sort of thing. So the classic fantasy orc horde. And the defenders are your classic fantasy noble human types, right? So they got their knights and their paladins and those kind of folk. But the rule mechanics are very different. So on the one side, the defenders are spending a time resource to do a bunch of things. And when they spend their time resources to do stuff, they have to give it to the attackers. And the attackers can use those time resources to, or maybe it's the other way around. Anyway, I can't remember exactly now. It's been a little while since I played, but one side is essentially spending time working. And by doing so, it is giving the resources to the other side to actually spend. Actually, level 7 Omega Protocol did this similar trick where they had adrenaline. And when the humans kept doing action, when the heroes kept doing actions, it empowered the hive mind player, the alien player, to get that adrenaline and use it as resources themselves. So several different games have done this mechanic, and it's sort of an interesting way to make asymmetry in the game. I think Stronghold is fantastic. Now, one of the things about Stronghold that makes it tough is it's very complicated. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of thinking, and there's no dice rolls, which means you can kind of run the numbers. So it does lead to analysis paralysis a little bit as players try to crunch all the numbers and figure out the optimal move. So that's maybe my one ding against it. But again, it's not too hard to follow in the end because there's only 2 sides. So once I can grok 2 sets of sides and I understand how the 2 sides interact with each other, it's not the end of the world to figure this all out, right? So again, that level of asymmetry where we completely change the rules for 2 sides of the game, but they're interlocked and I can clearly see how they interlock and I can understand the interlocking, and kind of understanding my side helps me understand your side. Makes it a little bit easier and more accessible. And the theme helps too, because you sort of expect from a theme like a castle assault situation, you would expect that the attackers, their life, how their things work should be a little different than the defenders, right? The defenders should have access to different stuff. So even the theme itself is asymmetric. So it kind of makes sense that both sides are asymmetric as well. So that was sort of the world of asymmetric games we were in when some of the newer games that have sort of been kind of pushing the boundaries of asymmetry have started coming out. And I think the one that it's actually one company that started really pushing this, and it was Leader Games when they did Vast. So what's interesting about Vast is each player takes on the role of a completely different character. So you have, and it's not, and I say character, I don't mean like a little adventurer going through a house. I mean like actually the house, or actually the spider that lives in the house, or actually the knight walking through the house, right? So you're all doing different things. Now, the interesting thing about this is every one of these players, they have not only do they have completely different mechanics, they have a completely different objective. And you have to sort of remember, what's cool about this is it's really fascinating to try to learn the game and play through it because everybody's function's completely different. Their mechanics are completely different. The things they do in a turn are completely different. Each person has a map that kind of walks them through that. And their victory objectives are literally completely different. It's not like I got to earn 10 victory points, you got to earn 15. It's like if I can control this many squares in the table and you can control that many sort of, and you've killed 5 creatures and I've done this, then I win. So you've got to kind of watch. And the other thing that's interesting about the game is there's a little bit of paper, scissors, rocks where different roles are designed to counteract the other role. And so if that player doesn't really realize that's their goal, there's no one there to stop the other guy. And so it's really interesting. And the replayability is very, very high. But I would argue the accessibility for light gamers is a little low, right? It's a little trickier to teach it. And it's definitely harder to master it. And it's really hard to play when you have several people who are veterans and one newbie. It's a little better. But if you have all newbies and one veteran, the veteran, unless they really pull back and sort of spend their time helping teach everyone, could walk the table pretty often, right? So it's a really interesting game, and you gain a lot of replayability, but also I think accessibility suffers a little bit. The game, so I'm not a huge fan of Vast, although I own a copy, and my daughter loves it. Most of my family love it. And so I'll break it out whenever they ask for it. Most of my niece and nephew also really like it. So I break it out whenever they ask. But I don't like it as much as the other leader game, the one that came out a little later, Root. So Root came out and I got late to the party on Root. Like I only got Root a year and a half ago or so. And my daughter introduced me to it and we liked it so much. We got all the expansions. I just backed and got their most recent Kickstarter for Root. So I have pretty much everything for Root right now, which is a lot. And what's interesting about Root, I think we've talked a little bit about Root on the show before. What's really interesting about Root is it is extremely asymmetric, but you're all playing on the same board and you're all running around with different pieces on this board. And many of the factions control armies, but some of the factions only have one piece. Other factions could have 40 pieces on the board. And the faction with one piece literally has one piece the entire game. They're running around like as a merchant trying to make profiteer off the war that's going on. Other factions are pretty easy to play and they're straight up just fighting stuff. Still other factions are like saboteurs and they're popping in and out and causing all kinds of trouble. Again, completely different mechanics. I mean, everybody's got the same phases, but their mechanics each player has are again completely different. The only thing that makes Root, I would argue, a little less confusing and Vast is that regardless of your crazy mechanics, every player is on the same victory point track that goes around the board. And every player is trying to get the most victory points by the end of the game possible. And there's a score you can get to. If you get to there first, you win. So that's sort of where everybody's trying to go. And then there's also some cards that can pop up that pretty much everybody pulls from the same deck of ability cards. And some of those cards let you tweak your victory condition, but everybody has access to those cards. Everybody kind of knows what those cards are. And it's very obvious when someone gets those cards, and they usually like control these 2 spots on the board and you can win instantly as opposed to winning on victory points, that kind of thing. So what makes Root, I think, a little less crazy than it could be is that I can look around the board. I can look at the victory point tracker and I can also see a player score a lot of points in one turn. And because at the end of the day, everybody's going to the same place, i.e. a certain number of victory points in the victory point tracker, I can immediately understand how each player's doing. And I can see if I'm falling behind, and maybe I can start talking, doing a little table talk and maybe talk about alliances or something we need to do to maybe slow that other player down, right? In a game like Vast, it's really hard to see if another player is actually doing well or not. And so it can be a little tricky. And so I think the asymmetric plays I seem to be gravitating towards more and more. I do really enjoy asymmetric rule sets more than I thought. I mean, I knew I liked them with the dungeon crawling games. Root was really fascinating to me because each of the factions is so very, very different. But one of the things I thought I wouldn't like was it was that different. I had to learn every time. And I thought my fellow gamers, who are mostly my family members now, then all of our kids are, late teens, even early 20s now, still love to game together, which is fantastic. And I thought Root would be a little bit intimidating, but it turned out that they all love Root, and it's tricky to teach, but you can learn it pretty quickly because the mechanics for each faction are relatively simple. So even though the rules are different, they're relatively simple. Unlike Vast, where it actually is a little bit complicated. So I think what's interesting about what they did is they learned a lot from Vast, and then they refined it for Root. And Root's a completely different game. Don't get me wrong. But it's like, we like to make crazy asymmetric stuff. This is Leader Games. So they're like, so what we're going to do is we're going to create Vast. And they did. And Vast was a lot of fun because it was so different. And they're like, yeah, but there's these things where people can't tell if they're winning and stuff like that. So they did Root. And Root, man, Root is a sweet spot of probably about as asymmetric as you can get and still understand what the heck's going on, I think. I feel like they're right in the bubble. And then they tried a new thing. And this is where I think they went too far. So then they did Oath. So my daughter Kit and I got Oath the other day, a while ago now. It was PAX East this year. So it was this year, I think Oath was pretty recent, right? It's still relatively new. And I was very excited for Oath because I like Root so much. And, no hate on the show, so it's just a bit of disappointment. I still have my copy of Oath. I still have faith in it. But what we ran into was it's sort of this it's asymmetric, but like most of the factions are kind of doing the same thing, and then one person's doing something else. So it's kind of like that one versus many thing. It's almost like they tried to merge two of the game styles I talked about today. The one versus many dungeon crawler idea, it's not a dungeon crawling game at all, but remember the one versus many game I talked about where you got one player trying to defeat the other players? So you sort of have that in Oath, right? There's this one sort of leader, evil overlord type person, and everybody has to kind of work against him or her, or they're going to win quickly. But then any one of those other players could sort of become the evil overlord themselves. And this is the right terminology. And then all of a sudden everybody's got to work against them. So you can kind of like switch it out. And on paper, I really want to like it. And I almost think like the fundamentals of it are fine. It's actually the combat system that got us into trouble. And we couldn't get past the combat system. I don't know why. Because every time we tried to interpret the combat system, we interpreted it a different way. And this is with the same person reading the rules over and over again. And all of us game, as you know, a lot. So I feel like we're missing something. I'm not really sure what it is. But I really wanted to like Root. I mean, not Root, Oath. And so Kit and I were talking about this morning. I was talking about this episode, and we were talking about she's got a pack to go to college, or I lured her on, I think, again. but we were talking about it, and she was like, "I want to give Oath one more try, Dad. I really want to try it again." I'm like, "I do too, Kit, but we can't figure out the combat system." And so, and the other thing about the game, and this is a pro tip for all of you out there who might be aspiring game designers. If your game has to say, like, look, your first playthrough this game is going to be rough. It's not going to be your third and fourth game. You're going to understand it and enjoy it. No. And you're putting that in the rule book. You want to be, your first game will be fun, but to really maximize all your strategic options, it'll take the 3 or 4. That I'm in on. But if your first game is not fun, and it's like, yeah, we know, but don't worry. If you keep playing, it gets fun. There's too many games in the world for that. I can't get behind that. I mean, I understand it, but I don't know if I can invest that much time into it. So I'm not trying to pick on them. I'm just like, it didn't work for me. Now, I'm sure there's people out there that love an Oath. It was very highly rated on Board Game Geek for a while. I don't know if it's still holding its position there. But I think it's an example of, it's really hard to tell, I think, in that game, unlike Root, again, who's actually kind of winning and how it all works. I just think that if you're talking about the maximized asymmetric game that's still understandable and teachable and reasonably accessible. I would not describe Root as a super accessible game, but it's reasonably accessible. I think Root, it might be the apex of how crazy you can get with your factions being different and still having a game that feels like everybody's trying to do the same thing and sort of involved in the same game at the same time, if that makes any kind of sense. So did all that make sense? So that's my thinking on different examples of asymmetric gameplay. We went all the way from, the Duke's light variant on asymmetric play on chess, all the way through the crazy stuff that our friends at Leader Games are doing with Root and Oath and Vast and everything else in the middle. And you have other games. You have things all across the spectrum, like you have games like Ankh, right, or Blood Rage, which have again, core mechanics are the same. The faction abilities are slightly different. You can probably think of dozens and dozens of games where the core mechanics are the same, but the factions are different. And that's extremely common asymmetric play, but it gets really interesting when the game developers start playing around with the rules. I just think that's fascinating. So it's this kind of thing I'd like to think about for some reason because I'm a little bit weird, but there you have it. I also have I've been doing this podcast for a long time too. So I definitely definitely a little bit weird. So what do you think about asymmetric games? Let me know. You can ping me on the Discord server. Let me know over there. Make a comment on our Patreon page, or hit me on Twitter at the D6 Generation. I'd be happy to chat with you all about that. So until next time, happy gaming.
Achievement unlocked! You've made it to the end of another D6 Generation episode, the podcast whose humor has universally been acclaimed as not too horrible. Please let us know what you thought of the show by emailing us at info@thed6generation.com. If for some inexplicable reason you actually enjoyed this show, you can help others find out about it by leaving positive reviews on iTunes. Thanks for listening and happy gaming.